Good evening. The time is 6:06, and we'll go ahead and get this Planning Commission meeting started. Just as a reminder to our commissioners, when you are speaking, please make sure to unmute your microphone so you can be heard on the broadcast. The public who did not register in advance can watch live the broadcast on our city's YouTube channel. For live Spanish translation services, please dial 720-386-9023 and use code 104091* to get Spanish translation services.
I would like to call this regular meeting of the Planning Commission to order. Will staff please do a roll call?
Commissioner Van Husen.
Present.
Commissioner Sanchez.
Present.
Commissioner Biltoff.
Present.
Commissioner Schechter.
Present.
Commissioner Eggleston.
Present.
Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you. Will everybody please join with me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Can I have a motion to approve the December 3rd meeting minutes?
So moved.
Second.
Please open electronic voting.
I had a question on the minutes. I'm sorry. Is it okay?
Yes,
It's
yes, sorry.
fine. When did Commissioner Kiefer's term officially start? Ryan, do you know when your appointment was effective? Because I didn't see it in the minutes here right now, but it showed that Kiefer was absent in the minutes that were emailed to us, so. Right. So I just want to make sure we have that correct.
We can make that correction.
Okay. Okay, so we just need to show him as present on the minutes. Okay, thank you.
And also to that point, just because I don't have it in front of me, because he wasn't a commissioner that was participating in the meeting, so I don't know if he should be marked as attending or absent regardless. He was in attendance, but he wasn't on the panel that evening. Yes, he was not seated.
Yeah, we'll make sure that that's notated if you want to make a conditional.
Yeah, so if we could rescind that motion, have an alternate motion to incorporate the comments with the adjustments as noted. Do we have a motion on that? Can I have a motion on that motion?
So moved.
I second.
Second.
Will you please, can we please open electronic voting? The motion passes 5 yeses, 0 noes. I will ask Planning Manager Heather Vidlock to please announce the first case.
This is Car Wash Pro Designers on behalf of Nolly Enterprises LLC is requesting approval of Burlington Northern Catalyst PUD Zone Document Amendment 6 to modify allowable commercial uses to specifically allow a car wash. The subject property is approximately 1.06 acres and located at 12411 East 104th Avenue. The case was continued at the December 3rd Planning Commission meeting. The applicant is requesting a continuance to the February 4th Planning Commission meeting. This continuance will afford them additional time to gather materials to fully address the concerns in the neighborhood. They are attending virtually if you have questions of the applicant.
Are there any questions for the applicant from any of the commissioners? Seeing none, are there any questions for staff? Seeing none, I make a motion to move case PUD A23004 to the next regularly scheduled Planning Commission meeting on February 4th.
Just for clarification, you're moving to continue the case.
Moving to continue the case to the next regularly scheduled meeting on the 4th. Is there a second?
I second.
Is there any further discussion?
I have a question. So if we continue this, has public comment already been done, or will that continue as well?
You can reopen the public hearing when you hear this in February
Okay, thank
and
you.
allow the public a chance to address you after the applicant presents their new information.
Thank you very much.
And then point of order, just for clarification for the other commissioners, because this allows the applicant to not have to repost at their site. So it saves them from having to do that again as the.
Right, yeah. When we're continuing a case, it's proper to continue it in a public meeting so that we don't have to re-advertise.
Thank you. Any other questions? Seeing none, please open electronic voting. The motion passes 5 yeses, 0 noes. Is there any commission business to discuss at this time? Seeing none. Is there any attorney business to discuss at this time?
No, Chair.
Thank you. Is there any staff business to discuss at this time?
Yes, just a couple of business items. We wanted to remind you of your January 28th special meeting. The consultant for the Land Development Code is going to be coming to present to you on the draft LDC. And so we need your presence at that meeting. It'd be really imperative that you're here on the 28th. And then a couple of updates from City Council last night. Council approved the Carbajal Automotive annexation and zoning. That's over on Rosalind Street, and that was on first reading, so that'll still need second reading. The other item that was approved was the Worthwhile Event Center, and that was the conditional use permit over in Derby. And then they did second reading on the One Buckley PUD amendment that you saw back in, I want to say, probably September. And it had been continued from the October meeting to council. So there were some conditions that council imposed on that One Buckley, and those were included in the final second reading ordinance.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The time is now 6:15, and this regular meeting is adjourned. We will take a brief recess and reconvene for a study session about the Land Development Code.
Is this what these are going to be like now? It was always such a
had so
longer
many.
agenda
I
when
know.
you and I first started doing this.
Well, you can look at our upcoming agendas. The only thing we have on February 4th is the Turnberry PUD.
We just had a huge backlog, or why was
Yeah,
it?
it was just timing.
Yeah.
Because ever since I've started, we've had
so it's like one.
We do the same amount of stuff. Nice, yeah, those are
So I
really
think
interesting guys.
No, if you want to join if you join the Zoom, then I can.
We can do
Sunset.
Okay.
Not even a year and a half later.
Let's see if we can do it this way.
Yeah. One thing to be said for institutional, I guess. Because I was there.
I don't have
so
so many, but
Mason.
So I think this year.
Well, so Robert Greene has all these.
Mhm.
Don't mind doing back office stuff, even though
It's all from.
I was the director 3 times.
Philosophy-based.
Stepped in twice as interim, and then
And I don't
the
necessarily.
last time they said,
agree with a lot of
"Just
stuff.
be the director,"
It's
and
all
then
Machiavelli.
I'll do
It's
that.
interesting to see.
as we switch to
Sure.
more direction.
Work that way.
Yeah, the kick.
Ryan Holidays.
Interesting. There's this nice financial
Interesting.
position. That was my head.
He has one where it's
My
Ego
job.
is the Enemy, it's one of his books.
You know Armand?
Yeah.
What's your last name? I was going to. He does with education bonds at the state level.
Oh, okay.
6,
One of the things
7, 7, 5,
I can't remember what it's called. They pulled funds from our people.
Interesting.
Education funds, they pull funds out to make
Interesting.
bond payments. Instead of financing.
I am. I've been like diving deep into. Totally hurry up. Yeah, that's right. I've been assessed to like a really, had a matter that was just taking up my time night and day. Unfortunately. It was older as a volunteer.
But he had a lot of the meetings.
Get emotional, yes. So that's cool. So I just wrapped all that up at the end of the year, so.
More language.
It's just good having time. He's been to ours, he doesn't go to anybody else's. And I'm aware of this.
Okay, I just, who had the one really big meeting that kicked everything.
Oh, yeah, he wasn't there.
Okay.
Oh, no, he just joined. He was there for that.
Okay, I think I met him.
Was it right?
Oh, he has a accounting background.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's a smart guy. That's interesting, 50 Cent and Robert Greene. I actually saw his name again, because exactly what kind of came out, as a whistleblower.
so do I have to,
They
when you
refused.
say share it into the Zoom?
I knew the amendments that Steve made.
Oh, okay.
Is that right?
That's pretty much.
That was almost certain. I knew it was like learning how to manipulate that kind of stuff, or. This sounds familiar, this sounds like, we had to turn Craig. There was a CIA, I think a CIA training manual.
He's a scoundrel.
I didn't used to agree with that.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The administrative one is interesting too, because it's not that, it just different stories about like Benjamin. She just like, but, yeah, I'm just all crashed, just different people. Yeah, there are some that successfully and then say to get the refresh of it.
Doing it, a couple programs on Teams or something, if you quit it, it'll give you a little bit more bandwidth.
well, yeah, I'm diving into that and like, just toxic workplaces and just, you know.
When I'm seeing it,
Work
on
in general,
YouTube,
how people, you know, how organizations
Okay.
form.
I'm not seeing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, where, yeah.
Do I just need to close the windows?
Yeah, Teams usually the one that takes the most bandwidth on the computer, so if you right click on it,
It's like in that master.
that doesn't like close it, it'll still do it in the background. So it's still taking memory.
It's like those.
So if you open Teams one more time, it's kind of a pain with the bills, unfortunately, but that's.
Well, I said that's for 9 years. It's K bilingual.
And then
Bilingual charter school.
right click on the symbol down there.
Before that, finance, tax and accounting. So.
Sure, there's a lot of good stuff.
Not
I kind of
even
have gotten out of it, it seems very casually written, right? And I've seen like a lot of rebuttals of certain things. I think it's easier, very rigorous, but yeah.
Yeah, it's easier, like,
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, it's like, I don't feel like.
I've been trying to read Nietzsche, but it's very, it's kind of a difficult read, but I've been working on it.
Only thing is still.
I've been working on trying to learn, it's called, original pronunciation of English, like British English, to be able to understand.
Yeah, let's try and get
the
you
original
pronunciation
pronunciation of it.
Okay.
Where then you actually get a lot
Now
more
I need
jokes and things.
The only reason I'm
Unfortunately,
doing
we
this
miss more and more.
Next year, I'll.
That's really interesting.
Essentially, I'm going to. Because usually if you do quit teams, that'll completely close on, it's not running a back $5. More $55 training.
Oh, uh-huh. Cool.
That, like that's.
Oh, yeah.
It's hard to remember because it's the late 1800.
Mhm.
Some of the.
Yeah, written for a certain audience, a certain context. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, I think it's going now.
You remember my number is 007. It's 1077.
Cool.
That's
Just a couple seconds behind, but still sharing the screen in there, so. On the live stream.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Flooring, like.
We're good to go.
Keep the idea of.
But if I'm going to, I think I'm done. If I'm going to kind
The
of.
idea that if you want to, you should try to.
This is fun.
There should be a way to just
Summarize the credit debit.
if you can't just.
Move forward. It's the whole thing's a game, and they tell you right or wrong. There's no two ways about it.
Well, I always
So,
looked
yeah,
at.
and he also wrote
Especially
like more of a
life.
social track there, which I haven't gotten into. So I don't know if he's actually a good read.
Okay.
Are you ready?
Yeah. So with the consultant coming at the end of the month to talk to you about the new code, we wanted to give you an orientation to the existing code. And then you can compare and contrast. And I can't go into every detail in the code, but I'm gonna give you an overview of how the land development code is updated. So just as a point of reference, land development codes are a new concept. When cities first had zoning codes, they had the municipal code, and then within that sat the zoning code. And then often outside of that sat the subdivision regulations. The new trend back in, probably the early 2000s was to come up with what was called a land development code. And that was to combine the zoning ordinance and the subdivision regs. And they often sit as adopted by reference in the municipal code. So they're not codified as part of the municipal code, but they're an adopted code by reference. So that's the way our land development code is organized. And it's available online and you can search it. So anything that you want to get deeper into that I don't have time to go through tonight, you can always go and do your own research. And what we've done is hire a consultant to help us with the update to the land development code. So they went sequentially through all the different articles in the land development code and they've been updating those. And staff's been reviewing the drafts and now it's time. So when some of you were on commission before, you may have seen this consultant come and present to you in the past, but it's been a while and a lot of you are new. So that's why we wanted the consultant to come do a full-blown refresher of the full LDC update. So with that, tonight, I'm talking to you about our existing code, and this is how it's organized. Article 1 is general provisions. Article 2 is administration. Article 3 is development review. Article 4 is zoning districts. Article 5 is use and accessory structures. Article 6 is subdivision standards, public improvements and design requirements. Article 7 is development and design standards. Article 8 is sign regulations. Article 9 is development fees. Article 10 is compliance and enforcement, and Article 11 is measurements and definitions. So these are the different zone districts that exist in the code. It's based on the density, or the intensity of the use. So they're tiered zoning. So R1 is single family zoning. R2 is like duplex zoning. R3 is like townhomes, and R4 is apartments. And then MHP is mobile home park. And then the commercial zoning is also tiered. So C1 is like your neighborhood commercial. C2 is more like service commercial, and C3 is more like regional commercial. And then MU is mixed use. And same thing with industrial zoning. The I1 and the I1S are the lower intensity, and then I2 and I3 get more intense in terms of the uses that are allowed. So this is called Euclidean zoning, based on when zoning was first enacted back in, I think, 1929. in the city of Euclid, Ohio, I think. And that set forth that cities have the ability to regulate zoning by districts. And so we have typical Euclidean zoning. Now, a big portion of the city is also zoned PUD. So most of the northern area of the city is zoned PUD. This map I've shown you before shows you the different zone districts, but also the land uses. So we hybridized a map for the economic development team to use to show straight zoning properties and then the land use that's allowed in the PUD. So all the yellow that you see is residential. And then the purple is industrial and red is commercial and green is agricultural. The different coloration of the residential is how much more intense it is. So the darker the color, the more intense it is. So that's how the city lays out. Each zone district has development standards that regulate the lot area, the lot frontage, the density, the floor area ratio, the setbacks, the height standards for each zone district. So floor area ratio is a ratio of how much building you're building compared to the lot area. So as you build up and you build out, you're increasing the floor area ratio. So a very dense site would have a higher floor area ratio than a very, like a low-rise one-story building would have less floor area ratio than a high-rise building. There's also performance standards in the code. So this goes back to the basic principle of zoning and the fact that you want to protect, usually protecting residential uses from the impacts of commercial or industrial uses. And these are basic standards that everything in the city has to meet. So we can't have uses that are creating vibration, noise, air pollution, odor, dust, electromagnetic radiation, hazardous materials, glare and heat, or materials and waste handling. So these basic performance standards apply across the board to the whole city. And they set up basic nuisance standards that you can't violate. There's extensive permitted use tables that outline all the different uses that the city allows. Pardon me. So we've got everything from agriculture to horticulture, adult businesses, animal services, antenna, building materials, eating and drinking establishments. Then it goes on to regulate financial institutions, food and beverage sales, fuel sales, funeral and interment services, office, personal services, recreation and amusement, repair services, retail establishments, vehicle equipment sales and service, visitor accommodation, office flex, auction house, artisan handcrafted manufacturing, contractor operations. And then there's a whole variety of manufacturing uses: chemical, food, machinery, metal, non-metallic minerals, oil and gas, textile and wood products, marijuana uses, motion picture and video industry, outdoor storage. We have railroad services, and this is quite extensive. When you compare Commerce City to most cities, we have the most industrial uses I've ever seen. But that goes without saying because we're an industrial community. So we cover the gamut. We even have toxic and hazardous uses: resource extraction, truck and transportation, housing, warehousing and distribution, waste management, remediation, wholesale establishments, airports, heliports, ambulance service, arts and culture, clubs and lodges, community services, daycare facilities for adult or child, golf course, hospital, public lands, parks and buildings, religious institutions, educational facilities, transportation facilities, utilities, zoos, and botanical gardens. So you can see how extensive our use table is. It takes up multiple pages in the code. And the way the use table works, it organizes by type of use. And then this is only the categories of uses. So I didn't even show you all the uses that are actually allowed. But for every use, there's a mark in the zone district about whether that's a use by right or a use by conditional use permit or a use by review. So a use by right means you can do it per the zoning and you don't need any special approval. A conditional use permit, you have to get a CUP and you have to go to planning commission and city council and have a public hearing. A use by permit is like a mini special use permit or conditional use permit, and that has to go to Board of Adjustment. So in residential uses, we have a variety of different uses. Group living facilities, multifamily, single family detached, which is like your typical single family home. Single family attached, which would be either duplexes or townhomes, boarding or room, home occupation, and senior housing. So multifamily would be apartments or condos. Okay, these are supplemental regulations. So for all of these types of uses, we have additional regulations that that regulate specific things about these types of uses. So for instance, childcare facilities have a list of regulations that just pertain to childcare. Marijuana businesses have regulations that just apply to them. Outdoor storage, truck and vehicle repair. So all of these uses have specific standards that have to be met. So you can see how complicated this gets.
I'm sorry, I don't know if we've
Yeah.
met. Are you the contractor that you met, the consultant that you mentioned, or are you a
Oh, I'm
staff?
sorry. No, I'm the planning manager.
You're the planning manager?
Yeah, I took Jennifer Jones's position last July.
Okay,
So,
I'm Robert. I don't have.
yeah, we've met.
Oh, have we? Okay.
I just must look, maybe I did my hair different or something,
No, it's
but we've
okay.
met before.
And at the
It's just
beginning, you
been a while.
said we would have, I think you introduced this by saying we'd have a consultant to give a big overview, but that's not
That's on the
this.
28th.
That's on the 28th.
That's the new code.
They're giving an overview of the amendments that they're proposing.
Okay, and so this is
So I'm
the,
giving
this
you
is
the
the,
compare and
this is
contrast.
the as is right now.
This is the as-is code.
Aha,
And then the consultant on the 28th is gonna give you the proposed code.
okay.
Um,
Do you want substantive questions during or at the end or?
we can pause, and if you've got questions, let's go over those.
Well, yeah, I'm interested in what the relationship is of the PUDs to the LDC.
Mm-hmm.
Can a PUD, can it change any of the underlying LDCs to start over with a clean board from scratch or?
Yes.
So the
Yeah, go ahead.
LDC is the code. So when you say the PUD to the LDC, are you saying the PUD to the zone that exists in that area geographically?
I guess both, yeah. So, yeah, I've heard feedback, I've heard feedback that it's kind of controversial how we use PUDs. That in a sense, it's a way for us to write novel law for that little area and avoid the LDC. So, but partially the zoning and then partially also, so it's both.
So they lay on top of each other. Where the PUD is silent, then the land development code applies.
Mhm. Okay.
So PUDs don't cover everything in every gamut. But some cities, PUDs lay on top of the zoning like a layer cake. So you might have R1 zoning, then you have a PUD that lays on top of that that says, well, here's the different setbacks or height regulations that apply in this PUD. In Commerce City, our PUDs take the place of the zoning.
Okay.
So instead of being zoned R1 or C1 or I1, it's zoned PUD. And then the PUD has use standards and development standards.
So they take the
apply
place
to
of the
that
zoning,
criteria.
but not the LDC per se.
Not everything in the LDC,
Okay.
but some of the standards in the LDC.
Okay.
May I ask a clarification?
Well,
for my-
I just had, so a point, because since Rob hasn't been here the last couple of meetings, as to why we're having this session as it pertains to this process, you might want to talk to that of what might be one of some of the outcomes as the code is updated relative to PUDs and
Yeah.
the zoning within the city, because he hasn't been part of that discussion. That might help
Yeah.
answer some of his.
Thank you. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and we've been doing these study sessions as training for the planning commission to kind of get you up to speed. So we did one last month on the comprehensive plan. So we're trying to just get the new planning commissioners up to speed in terms of here's the comp plan, here's the code. But in terms of the effort with the LDC update is to modernize and update the code. One of the outcomes of that will also be a legislative zoning action that'll follow the adoption of the code. And that will be to potentially rezone parts of the city to the new zone districts in the new city, in the new LDC. And so we might even take away some of the PUDs and zone them to straight zoning. And we might take some of the straight zone parts of the city and change the zoning. So cities can legislate what's called legislative zoning, when the city takes action and zones a large area in a specific way or a small area. Versus like what you're used to seeing when an applicant comes forward and presents a zoning case where they're rezoning something. That's for a specific parcel that the applicant is requesting. Then it's a quasi judicial public hearing that you do in your session and plan city council finally adopts it. When you do legislative zoning, then the city is doing comprehensive zoning of a large portion of the city.
Okay.
Yeah,
My question was, then within a PUD, using both of these, if you have a PUD that has 3 sections, a commercial, R, low density or R1 and higher density, then you've just basically mapped out what area will be used within that PUD. And then the land development code will say here in your commercial area, these are the number of parking spaces that will be required. And this is the type of landscaping that is required. Is that kind of how they work together?
yeah, and some PUDs have more detail than others. So some PUDs might have their own parking standards.
Right.
But if they're silent on parking,
Then that's when
then you
go to
fall back
LDC.
to the code.
Okay, thank
Yeah,
you.
that's why Commerce City is kind of unique in that you're not layering the PUD on top of the zoning, but yet where the PUD is silent, the zoning, the LDC still applies.
So you go to the PUD first.
And then
And
the
then-
LDC within the PUD.
If it's
it's
not
silent.
outlined in the PUD, then you go to the LDC.
Thank you.
Good question. Any other questions about this so far? It's a little bit dry, but that's what zoning code is. So,
The code is dry. All
yeah, codes are dry. But at least you're getting a picture of how detailed the code gets into things. So for residential uses, we have accessory uses. So this is pertinent to, the residential neighborhoods. We allow car storage, sheds, porches, patios, decks, arbors, gazebos, pools, hot tubs, recreation courts, and dog runs. So these kinds of uses evolve and change over time. Sport courts or recreation courts are a new thing. Those didn't really, people had tennis courts back in the day, but nobody really had those little sport courts that people have in their yards now. So zoning codes evolve and change over time. And so you have to adapt and change. Sometimes you just do micro adjustments to your code, like we did for the short-term rentals that you saw, like we did for the natural medicine regulations. Those are just amendments to the code. Other times you're doing a comprehensive update to the code. So that's how we regulate accessory uses in residential.
One more thing for Commissioner Schechter. I think the other thing we're trying to do is do this process differently than how the comp plan process went. So that's part of why do this training first before the consultant comes in and explains everything that they want to amend. Because if you're shown a bunch of amendments with no foundational understanding, that can be overwhelming. So that's what we're trying to do this time differently.
Do we have like a high level policy document of what we are giving to the consultant, like what specifically we want to change, that kind of thing?
Sure, there's been a lot of back and forth, but I don't think
That'd be interesting
there's
to-
anything prepared
I've been
in the
to
way
a
you're
public
asking.
hearing already with this consultant in the past. So they did have public hearings and outreaches and so
Okay.
forth to actual citizens. And then I think they've worked a lot with the planning department as well.
They have, and we have a public open house on the 29th. So we're taking advantage of the consultant being here in town, and we're having that public open house too.
And the consultant, they actually write code for us.
Yes,
Uh-huh.
they're the type of consultant that we hired does this exclusively. They write codes for cities.
Interesting, okay.
That's their sole job. They do this all over the country.
And they're
Yeah.
looking at the
I had a
whole
question.
thing.
So for the accessory use in the last slide, that's going to be further restricted by the people who live there, but they cannot be further expanded, right?
Are you talking about like an HOA?
So yeah, so like we allow hot tubs in an area or pools in an area.
Mhm.
So the city allows it, but then you could say, the HOA can say, well, we don't allow it. They could further restrict it. But
Yes,
if we didn't allow pools at this level, the HOA could not come in and say, we're gonna allow pools.
right, yeah. HOAs are private restrictions and they can be more limiting. So HOAs could say, for instance, on fencing, that you can only have a certain type of fencing or it can only be a certain height or a certain style. The code probably isn't gonna go into that level of detail that the HOA is going to.
The HOA can't be more free. They can only be more restricted.
Yeah, right. The HOA can't allow things that aren't allowed in the underlying code.
Generally speaking, unless there's like.
Yeah, I haven't necessarily seen PUDs that, I mean, the one thing would be like, the Suncor refinery, that's a PUD. The landfill is a PUD. So there's some uses that are so unusual that the code doesn't necessarily address it. And so we've used PUDs, to regulate those. Okay, so that's residential accessory uses. I wanted to talk for a minute about the concept of non-conforming uses and structures. So most codes, in fact, every code I've ever seen, has language that talks about a non-conforming use and a non-conforming structure. So when you change the code or you change the zoning on a property, you can create non-conformities. For instance, you could have a property that's residential that then gets zoned industrial, and then you have a house on an industrial piece of land. That's a non-conforming use. It was conforming at the time it was built, but then something changed, either the zoning changed or the code changed that made it non-conforming. So there's non-conforming uses, and then there's non-conforming structures. A non-conforming structure would be a building that was built under a certain zone district regulation. And then that zone district regulation changed. Maybe the setbacks got more restrictive. And so the structure became non-conforming, meaning it was legal at one point when it was built, and then it became non-conforming, or the zoning changed on it, which changed the setbacks. So non-conforming structures cannot be enlarged as to the portion that's non-conforming. And they cannot be rebuilt if they're damaged more than 50% of their value. Non-conforming uses cannot be expanded or enlarged, and you can't have a change in use. If you discontinue your non-conforming use for 180 days, you lose your non-conforming status. So we do a lot of research on this here at the city. People come in and they actually want a non-conforming use letter to document that the use that they have is non-conforming. Non-conforming structures, this comes into play when someone's coming in for a building permit and we're looking at, okay, what portion of the house are they trying to expand? Is it the non-conforming portion of the house? And we can't issue a permit to enlarge or make or alter that non-conforming portion. So I just wanted to highlight non-conformities for you.
In that same line, do you anticipate with projects that are ongoing, a lot of
I don't know how to deal with perhaps grandfathering things in or,
So that's what this is. So when
Okay.
something's non-conforming, it's allowed to continue as is, and it's not forced to conform to whatever the change in requirements
okay,
is.
so that,
Unless they want to start to alter it to a certain degree, then they're gonna say, well, if you're gonna rebuild it, now you have to conform to these
Sure.
requirements as they exist today. But when something changes, it's allowed to stay as is
right,
without being in trouble for being non-conforming.
so that's where, okay.
That's fine.
Yeah, grandfathering is another phrase that people
Right.
use. But the technical term is non-conforming.
This is way out in the future relative to this. What would be what would be the timeframe for projects that are in for current development under current zoning for them to see that out from when the new zoning is adopted? Has that been discussed yet as to what that timeframe
And how we would treat existing projects.
is? Yeah, projects that are in development under the current code.
Yeah, we're gonna have to start communicating with developers as the code is getting contemplated.
Sure.
Because things that are gonna cross over into the new code, if things would not comply with the new code. In most cases, I think the new code is gonna be more liberal.
Sure.
Um,
But I was just thinking in terms of this, where you're going, where it's something that's in process,
Mhm.
in design, that's gone through our myriad of discussion or whatever, then it's non-conforming as it's being constructed or designed. For
Yeah.
those projects, that's what
I
my
think
question
what we'll bump into more is when we do the legislative zoning,
was.
we're gonna create nonconformities.
Mhm.
And we're gonna create nonconformities when we adopt the new code.
Mhm.
So structures that previously met the zoning standards may not meet the new zoning standards in the new code. And so we're gonna create nonconformities. It'll just be inevitable.
I just didn't know if there was gonna be a time frame that say that your project is, that you've, like when they update building codes, that you've submitted under the previous
Yeah,
building
you
code.
submit under the old code, right,
Yeah.
versus.
That
the
you
new
submitted
code.
it by, and then you have so long to obtain your building permit. Is there going to be something relative to that developer? I just didn't know what
It
that.
depends on
time
where they are in their process. And
Okay,
so that's, I think, what she means by they're trying to talk to some of the developers if
Sure.
there is some room to make some adjustments. But if they're far enough along that they can't change it, they're not gonna be penalized for that.
okay,
I think for the most part, people may want to take advantage of the new code.
sure,
So they would want to be, or if they're doing a PUD, then it's kind of absent the code anyway. And the standards that we're changing, we're not changing everything.
Mhm.
And even like the use tables,
Sure.
probably a lot of those are staying the same. We're probably adding new uses that aren't existing because they weren't contemplated when the existing code was put in place.
Yeah, I remember that when they came in and spoke, like the residential, that there's a different type of residential where it was the more, I can't remember the term that they used.
Residential village. is
Well, then
the
they
new-
also had, it was for larger site. I can't.
Like the estate lots.
The estate lots, where that's not under current zoning, but they
Right.
had that under the new zoning.
Right. So yes, we're definitely gonna have to work closely with the applicants as we make the transition to the new code.
It's one of those inevitable things that always happen, but I was just
Right.
curious what that,
And why these sections exist everywhere.
yes,
Yeah, why the non-conforming structure and use sections exist,
yes.
because you wouldn't have a way to deal with these buildings and uses if you didn't have that provision.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. So there's a whole section on telecommunication facilities. Monopole standards, co-location requirements, which means if there's an existing pole, you have to allow other users to be on that pole so that you don't have a proliferation of poles. There's sections about putting telecommunication facilities on existing buildings or structures or co-locating on existing poles or structures. There's a whole section on subdivision standards. So remember, subdivision is dividing land. when we did our previous training and we talked to you about the land development process. Subdividing is dividing land and lots. So there's regulations on how you name your subdivision, your street naming, your lot design, your blocks, your streets and circulation, your alleys, and then private and public open space. There's required public improvements in the code. So you can't sell a lot to someone that doesn't have water and sewer and stormwater. So there's requirements in the code that says the developer has to put in sanitary and water facilities, has to put in stormwater facilities, has to install streetlights, has to do the underground utilities, has to put in streets, curb, gutter, and sidewalks.
So Jason had said that the city didn't have oversight on the streetlights and that it was the utility company that did. Is that the case or no?
Put in the streetlights?
For the spacing, the actual requirements for how many we're supposed to
Yeah,
do?
usually the utility department has the standards and then the city abides by that, but the requirement for the developer to put in streetlights is in the code. It says you, Mr. Developer, must put in streetlights. But maybe that's not what you're asking.
Yeah, because I was asking Jason how, the city manager, how often we could how often streetlights required. And he said the city didn't have oversight into the demands of where those would be. It's up to the utility, and then up north it's United, down here it's South.
Okay.
Is that the case? Because it says streetlights there, but I'm just fine.
Yeah, again, it's just telling the developer that they're required to install streetlights.
But no
It's
requirements.
not saying the actual standards for how the streetlights get installed or what the spacing requirement is. It sounds like that's in this area, that's up to the utility provider. Because the utility provider actually owns the streetlights. It's their infrastructure. Just like the city owns the streets, the public and the sidewalks. And then South Adams County Water and Sewer District owns the water and the sanitation infrastructure. So the developer is putting in public infrastructure that the developer is not going to retain ownership of. But they have to set up the property for development. So there's also development and design standards regarding land and habitat designation, traffic management, pedestrian access and circulation, private parks, open space and trail design, landscaping, architectural and design guidelines, and then there's miscellaneous design guidelines. So we have pretty extensive landscaping and architectural design guidelines, which is great for a community like Commerce City because we get high quality development then. Not a lot of these are newer types of standards. So if you look at old zoning codes or you go to a small town somewhere in the Midwest, they're not going to have sophisticated design standards. And so you're going to end up with whatever the franchisee wants to put in terms of their building design. Here we have pretty strong requirements that talk about the materials being stone, that you have a base, middle, and top, that you have windows and glass, so that we get high quality architecture. So we have sign regulations. We could spend all night on signage, but we're not going to. Signage has to be content neutral. That's a Supreme Court finding. A case that came down that said cities can't regulate the content of signage, but we can, what's that?
No one can.
Yeah. No one can regulate them, including cities. So we regulate the wall signs, ground signs, temporary signs, and then there's signs that are prohibited. So we have a whole sign regulation chapter.
Wasn't that chapter was just updated?
Yeah,
like
that's a
year-
new
like
chapter.
couple of years ago or
Yeah,
something.
we
Yes.
updated post-read, which was a pretty recent decision. We went ahead and did the updates on that. So by content neutral, it just means, we don't differentiate between if it's an election sign or a school sign or whatever. The way that we address signs is it a temporary sign or a permanent sign? It can only be this big or this many in a certain area, or they can't cover windows, or you can't have this type of material. It's all that type of stuff, and it's the same for all kinds of signs. nothing to do with what the sign is talking about or who's posting it.
So there's a whole section on fees. We have fees that cover everything from school impact fees, parks fees, road fees, water acquisition, fire and emergency services, oil and gas impact fees, public safety fees, general government fees, and public works fees. So again, here, we're pretty sophisticated in making development pay its own way by paying all these fees, and these get assessed at the time of building permit. And I think that's it. So that kind of walks you through how the land development code is organized. Again, we wanted to give you this overview so that when the consultant comes, they're going to use a very different approach when they're presenting to you. And we're reorganizing the code too. So it won't necessarily look the same in terms of how they present it. But they're going to highlight for you, like in the development procedures section, you know, how does it work today versus how is it going to work? What's changing about the code? I've told them that they have more time with you than they do with council. So they're going to slow down and let you ask questions and walk you through that. So you'll have a full range of opportunity on the 28th. Any more questions about the code? About the land development code and what it does?
Thank you.
Yeah. And enjoy your new books. You've got those to peruse. Those are produced by the American Planning Association. So I think it's a pretty good read and should be helpful to you. If we don't have anything else, then we'll let you guys get out of here for tonight.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Not relating to this, but about our furthering education. I'd like to know if we could have a brief tutorial maybe on crafting motions where we are not going to recommend approval.
Okay.
Because you can't just say, I don't like it, you know, or.
And you have to make findings.
Exactly.
Mhm.
I'm against bounce houses, you know, or something. You don't just, so if we're.
Well, it wouldn't be an arbitrary reason like that. It would have to be
That's what-
because it doesn't meet the requirements.
That's what I'm saying. So I
Yeah.
would like to have maybe a tutorial on what we can look at to say, okay, this is why it's an appropriate denial, not just I don't like something, you know?
Mhm.
So if we could at least schedule it at some point, something, because I have watched council and on council's motions to deny things, they have a good solid standing of why they deny it. And I'd like to be able to say some of the things, I mean, they've used in the past of it creating an undue burden on different things, whether it's undue burden on traffic or on infrastructure, on, you know, the school systems in that area, on, you know, so there is a list. So maybe we could have a brief rundown or just a list of things that are appropriate, only appropriate.
Right,
Yeah.
so the list is what those requirements are. So when
The
staff's
criteria.
telling you, does it meet the criteria? That's the word they use. Thank you. Does it meet the criteria? That list of criteria is your list of things that would be an appropriate reason to deny if it doesn't meet any of those.
But I've seen in the past where council has used things that, yes, it met these 6 listed criteria, but they've said something like, I do not wish to approve this because it doesn't meet things that aren't listed.
Well, that's not okay.
Okay, that's why I'm asking. I'm like, I've seen things happen. I've seen things
Yeah.
we approved that council didn't.
Mhm.
Right.
And they've used criteria.
They
that-
also have a little bit, you know, they're the final say. They're actually being asked to approve or deny.
Right.
You're not being asked that.
Right.
You're being asked to recommend or not recommend based on whether it meets the criteria.
Okay, and only the criteria that are listed.
Yes.
All right, so that was my question, because I'm like, if something meets these criteria, however, council is like, it does not meet all these other criteria that were not listed.
Yeah.
So,
Also, and I'm not speaking about any particular occasion that's happened in council, but just human beings are human beings. And just because you see someone else do it doesn't mean
it's
that it was
appropriate.
according to Bob's rules.
Okay,
Well, and making a solid record is really important, because if someone were to challenge a case, they would go back to the record and say, what were the commission's findings? What were the council's findings? And if ever you want to make written findings, you can always ask for a continuance, and we can prepare written findings for you. So you could say, you know, we're inclined to not recommend approval of this, but we'd like to postpone the action until the next month. And we ask the city attorney and the staff to put together written findings that would support our recommendation for denial. Because often what you see in the staff report is findings that support the application.
mhm,
And so you can't necessarily use that because you want to make an opposite finding.
correct.
And so it's hard on the fly to say, per criteria X, I find that this is not met because of such and such. And so you really have to be on your toes to try to come up with those findings at the time.
Yeah.
That's why we have those binders up there. That is that list of criteria. So you can remind yourself and then kind of help go through that checklist. If you're trying to in the moment, you know, ask yourself again, and staff, you can always ask them to bring back up a slide too. But to ask yourself, you know, does it meet all of these? And if you think it doesn't, then that's helps you craft that language that you're looking for.
Yeah,
But if it does meet all the criteria, then are we gonna always approve it?
Well,
You should. If
So
it
it's-
meets all the criteria,
I
you
think
should be
again, helpful to reframe that, because you're not being asked to finally approve or deny anything. You're being asked to recommend to council based on whether it meets the criteria. Right? So the final approval denial question, that goes before council. You're being asked a little bit different question. So I think that's important to keep that framing in your mind.
But I think to directly answer you, the answer is yes. The answer, I think, is what's being put to us is us with our human judgment. Does this actually meet the criteria? And that's kind of, some of these could be a judgment call, it could be a question of fact. And if so if you personally, in your judgment, oh yes, they've actually met their burden of all these different things, then you should approve it. You should approve the motion. That's my understanding of what we're doing. I could come up with a couple things that are not on the list, yet are nonetheless valid reasons for denying. So for example, anything that violates the US Constitution, anything that has a discriminatory purpose, that per se, we should not approve. And that's a good reason too. And that kind of goes in every
I
court.
think that's where it's helpful to remember the question being asked you. The
Uh-huh.
question being asked you is not, should you approve or deny? Because that's a
Okay.
very final question that feels
Uh-huh.
like it has a higher weight. And that's the question being asked council. You're being asked, do you recommend this based on whether it meets the criteria or not?
Meeting the intent of the criteria, correct? Of what so that's our interpretation, is the intent of what the criteria is asking
Right.
the applicant in that instance relative to whatever's going on that parcel.
Sure, and I agree there can be judgment call in the criteria. That's your role there to think that. Now, should it be approved based on all of these extra things? I think that's where it's important to remember the question being asked you, that question's being asked to council. You're being asked, should you recommend this
Mhm.
to council because it has met the criteria or not?
That's interesting. Yeah, I'd like to see that, the statutory basis for that. That's interesting.
Sure, it says in the land development code that your role is to recommend. So it's not listed as approve or deny. That's the language for the council.
but maybe I misspoke. What I meant to say is to recommend denial,
Sure.
not to deny. We're not denying, but
Well-
to recommend denial based on, and then there are criteria that might come up, you know, that are not listed in, it did meet these things. However, I see that I don't want to recommend approval due to this undue burden that isn't listed in these three things, but
You have to make your finding based on the criteria.
well,
You're
on
gonna
what
have to tie
criteria?
it to there's criteria for every type of
Right,
land
and
use.
do we get all of the criteria
Yes.
listed? Okay, so
In-
this
That's
is where
what
my
they say in the
question was.
case, when they go through and says by these criteria.
By
And then they
these,
ask,
and if that is
That's the full
every criteria, then I'm good with that. But what I was saying is, if we have three criteria, but actually there are 7 they should have met.
No, they're all listed.
Okay,
in the
that's
staff
my
report.
question, so.
And in the PowerPoint, we always go through those slides pretty quickly, but we can go slower, we can pause. We can always bring those slides back up that have the review criteria if you want to see it again.
Oh, and that's why we have the binders there. If you want to look at it on your own time outside of the PowerPoint, those are just printed straight from the code off the internet. They are not altered in any way. That is the complete list of criteria straight out of the code.
and I think that this whole discussion, I think that's been some of the complexity and issues that have happened previously, is that there was opinion outside of those criteria that might have gone into
Recommendations.
recommendation
Yeah.
or not recommending. Just its personal opinion, not necessarily contained within the criteria.
If you go outside of your criteria, you run the risk of your decision getting overturned.
Sure, sure.
If an applicant were to get denied and the council did not base their findings on the criteria in the code, then a judge could overturn that decision.
For me, the real risk is, it's not merely overturning, but the cost of litigation and reputation. We don't want that.
that's-
We should actually just do it right and follow the law.
Mhm.
To me, that's the real thing. Still though, you haven't persuaded me yet. I'm not convinced of your position.
So that's an important
Just one
part of
you talk about
deliberation.
later.
You know, when you talk about wanting to express opinions, that's part of the deliberation process. That's on the record, that whole deliberation. You know, it might not be a part of your motion in the end, but that's part of the deliberation process, is to express those concerns.
And I think some of the confusion previously is people's understanding of what is in our purview, and what's not in our purview relative to those requirements. I think
That's why I'm trying to really talk about
Yes.
thinking about what the question being presented to you is. And
So,
I
I
understand I
understand
might
that.
sound a bit strict as far
No, I
as you're
think that's
imagining it,
great.
but I think has been a point of confusion, and
Sure.
I'm trying to structure that in a way that's helpful.
I just think that's orthogonal. I think that's not quite on point. I'm sorry, I just like, so for example, if someone, brought to us, parking for white people, it's a great parking lot, for white people. It's awesome. And if they meet all of the
That's even just hard to hear, even though I
Right.
know you're using it
just
for
trying to
that,
use,
it's
like, something that's just
still hard, you know?
plainly on its face, the intent, and it's plainly discriminatory. I'm just sitting here trying to come up with an example. But they meet all of the LDC criteria, then me as a judge, I would, if the question put to me was, does this meet the criteria? I would say, yes, it does. But that's not the question being asked. The question being asked is, do we recommend this for approval? I would say no, because it's illegally discriminates, or it's intends to.
So if it's illegal, I doubt that it would meet the criteria, because often the
I don't-
criteria is to meet the requirements in the LDC. So I think the criteria are incorporating more than you might be giving them credit for in this moment,
Okay.
in this hypothetical. But again, that's also something that can be brought up in deliberation.
Mhm.
And also, you can make any motion you want to make. It is gonna
Sure.
open up the risks that she's
Yeah, I'm just
talking about.
answering to you,
Yeah,
like,
and thank
what
you,
would
I
be-
appreciate that.
What would be a valid thing to put in a motion that, says we do not recommend approval? I would pull, something say this is discriminatory. That would be a valid thing. It breaks a more fundamental law or public policy. That's just my point of view.
I get it.
Yeah.
And thank you, because that's where I was trying to go. I'm like,
Yeah.
if it meets these criteria, but strangely somehow is just absolutely wrong,
Yeah.
it's a slaughterhouse for kittens.
Criteria is
You know,
always
I think-
subjective.
Yeah.
I'm like,
Look,
does it
kittens
meet
aren't a protected
criteria?
class.
Yeah, it's like a
But-
slaughterhouse for kittens.
But-
I don't want to recommend
See, now that I don't
council
know.
approve
That I
a
don't know.
slaughterhouse for
This is
kittens.
This is an interesting conversation. I don't.
It's a given, but.
it might be
I think the
offensive,
criteria
but,
are subjective enough that you can find the wiggle room.
Okay,
I think.
okay, you can
we-
find something to point to, something to hang your hat on.
Yeah.
Criteria are, they do have certain burden requirements. It does need to meet the LDC, which, you know, the LDC isn't gonna allow something that's illegal. You know, so there's a little bit broader than
Okay.
just one sentence if you're really thinking it through. And again, deliberation is a place to express concerns, and that will be on the record. That can be communicated, that's gonna go to council as part of the full record that they
and
see.
then if we do ever run into such a situation, can we ask for assistance in crafting a motion?
Yes.
Okay, so that's my thing where I can just say, let me just spill my guts on why I don't think a slaughterhouse for kittens, even though I think it meets these criteria, but I feel fundamentally it's not right to recommend approval. So can you help me craft something, or is there anything that I might be able to, to rely on with my gut feeling? And then you might be able to help us craft, even though you don't believe, you're like, no, it met the criteria. I think you could state it this way and then see if people agree with you.
I can't put words in your
No.
mouth, but I can certainly help you hone those words.
Okay, thank you.
And I think you may have noticed sometimes when some motions have gotten a little
Very
lengthy,
wordy or-
I try to restate it for you and say, I hear you saying this.
I appreciate that.
Is there a way to do that off the record or in executive session? Because then
I can
that,
give you
yeah.
legal advice in executive session, but we
Okay.
wouldn't be able to go into executive to just craft a motion.
Okay, gotcha.
Glory.
I was wondering, I actually did have a question coming into this related. We often have we always have public hearing, public speaker, people from the community can come up and give their opinion on something before we vote on it. But of course, the content of those are rarely aimed at one of these elements that we're looking to meet, right? So I guess it kind of presents a bit of a difficult case for us. We have to really think, okay, what they're telling me, does that fit into any of these cases or not? That kind of thing.
That is the question being asked.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But they might talk about impacts that you could say, well, there's impacts to the adjacent property. And
And that would be an element, yeah.
that could be an element in the criteria,
And
or it's not
almost anything.
compatible with the surrounding area.
Almost anything will have an impact, but is that an undue
Mhm.
impact? It's like, well, there are gonna be 5 cars driving down my street now instead of 3.
Well, that sounds like something we could ask legal counsel about. Like what's the current notion of what is undue impact? Is there a test that's known or that kind of thing?
Or maybe I don't have to prove undue, but I have a feeling this may be an undue, so I don't recommend approval. Council can go through more detail at that point and say, all right, there was a concern that there would be undue impact. However, we spent the time to ask the, city engineer, is this gonna create an issue with stormwater? Because that was what they thought for, this water park or something, so.
Yeah, that'd certainly be, back to the deliberation point, you can say, I'm not, I think what's been presented seems that it meets the criteria, but I'm still concerned that this hasn't been wholly thought through, or that this might have a bigger impact than what's being presented, or than what the traffic study has shown. That you can say those things during deliberation.
And then that could go to council, even if it's a recommendation to approve
Right.
or to not approve, but it would say planning commission's concerns were such and such or such and such, for your deliberation for council to look into.
Right.
Is that appropriate? Do you think that's?
Yeah, you can bring up all of your concerns in deliberation. That's the point of it. And that's
Well, he's
part of the
talking- well,
record.
You're talking about in deliberation, we can bring up all those points, but I think part of what you're asking is, can we have the concerns forwarded to city council along with?
At that point, I think it's been done, hasn't it, that they have in the past, that planning commission had the following concerns, but does recommend council approve. Or the opposite, which is planning commission did not recommend approval due to these following concerns.
Yeah, well, if you don't recommend approval, and the concern or the reason for not recommending would be
Should
your
be in the
motion.
motion.
So for the deliberation, that is a part of the record, and that does go to council. That doesn't mean they all sit and watch the whole thing. I think what we talked about was maybe putting like a minute marker for each hearing in the minutes? Has that been?
Yeah, no, we don't do that.
Okay.
But we do put a summary of your comments in the
Okay.
minutes. And you've been seeing that in the last couple
Yeah.
rounds of
And I've
minutes.
seen on the agenda that when the council gets it, it'll say planning commission, minutes or something, or meeting.
Yeah, the
And-
minutes are
and
part
then
of
you
the
can,
packet.
yeah, you can click on it and it would summarize what the planning commission had stated about that specific item.
But if you put it in the motion, you know everybody's gonna see it.
Yeah.
And if you tie it to the criteria, you know you've got a solid motion.
Right. And then they can still go ahead and do their own thing, whether it's
Yes.
what we approve or not, and that's their purview. But at least it shows that we took it seriously. Okay. Sorry, that was supposed to be a quick question.
No, it
That's
was
okay,
good. We
and-
have time.
You can always ask me any of those questions whenever you want to. Doesn't have to wait for open meetings.
Perfect.
If we hear that, if someone gives us feedback that city staff is not implementing a rule correctly, for example, they're applying a content filter or content-based decision to signage decisions, who would we go to with something like that?
Well, applicants can appeal
Mhm.
the decision of the city administrator, and they can go to the Board of Adjustments.
Okay,
So they would appeal that decision, or
Okay.
someone else could appeal it.
Sort of just depends on the nature of the problem
Mhm,
and who
mhm.
it would go to.
But you'd be the key person to ask where to go, right?
Yes.
There, I'm getting the point that you are our go-to for what we should do outside of this to find the right path.
I am your legal advisor,
Okay.
and Heather might be able to help with some of that if
Yes.
it's a staff question. So she can help. you
Yeah, and
sometimes
hopefully
too.
staff's not doing those kinds of things where we're operating outside the code. But sometimes people are aggrieved by the decision. They don't like the decision that we made. Either a neighbor doesn't like it or the applicant doesn't like it if we turn them down. So they have an appeal process to go to the Board of Adjustment and do an administrative appeal.
In the case I know of, it wasn't a party to the request. And so it seems like might be a staff training issue.
Hmm.
It's the thing I know about, so
Okay.
I guess I can just talk to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's how I see
Please.
it.
Yeah, I would say let's not talk about that in an open meeting for the moment. That could be a one-on-one conversation.
I don't want to know
another time.
anything about it.
For sure.
I prefer to know.
Okay, anything else for tonight? Well, we appreciate your time. We are gonna do some follow-up at the February 4th meeting. We'll have a study session to the LDC update, just to start getting your comments. Anything that you have further questions on, or if you have comments about the code changes that you don't have a chance to make. Because the applicant or the consultant's gonna be presenting to you on the 28th. So if you want to save up your comments and your questions that you don't get a chance to ask, bring those on February 4th and we'll do another study session. We're sorry, we're kind of exhausting you on these study sessions, but we're trying to catch up on a lot of work. And the chair and I had talked at the beginning of the year about all the things, or the end of last year, about all the things we wanted to do to help train you, get everybody up to speed.
With so many new people. So
Yes.
it's been good timing.
Okay, great.
Thank you for taking the time to put these together.
Receive.
Very dry presentation.
Well, Garrett, thanks for your question. Apparently it was not good at articulating what I meant, and you actually came back to it and
Happens all the time.
stated it better than I did, so.
I'm so excited to have our little mini towns now for
So then.
when we're out.
Right.